Welcome, everyone, to another story that's bound to keep you on the edge of your seat. Today, we delve into the quiet hallways of Glenwood High, where an unassuming janitor, known to all as Mr. Gray, goes about his day with little fanfare. But, as the saying goes, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the humble exterior lies a past shrouded in mystery and heartache, one that, when uncovered, will send shockwaves through the entire community. What happens when a man who has spent years hiding from his past is suddenly thrust back into the spotlight? And how will the students and staff of Glenwood High react when they learn the true identity of the new janitor? Grab your favorite chair, settle in, and get ready, because this story is just beginning. The first time Thomas Gray walked into Glenwood High, no one paid him much attention. Just another janitor, they thought, someone to clean up after the day's chaos. He was dressed in the standard uniform, grey overalls, a worn-out cap pulled low over his forehead, and a pair of well-worn boots that had clearly seen better days. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The students rushed past him in the hallways, too absorbed in their own lives to notice the man who had quietly begun to make his mark on the school. Mr. Gray kept to himself, moving through the school with a quiet efficiency. He was always there, whether early in the morning before the first bell rang, or late in the evening after the last student had gone home. He didn't speak much, just a polite nod or a soft "good morning" to those who greeted him. But it was his eyes that set him apart. There was a depth in them, a sadness that seemed out of place for someone in his position. It was as if he was carrying a weight no one else could see. Emily Dawson noticed it first. She was in the art room after school, lost in her sketches, when she heard the door creak open. Mr. Gray stepped in, mop and bucket in hand. He moved with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice, but something about the way he glanced at the easels, the brushes, and the canvases caught her attention. It was a look of familiarity, of recognition. She watched as he fixed a broken faucet with a few deft movements, his hands working with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Do you paint?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Mr. Gray looked up, surprised. "No, not any more," he replied quietly, his voice gravelly yet gentle. "But I used to, a long time ago." There was a pause as Emily considered his words. She wanted to ask more, to dig into the mystery of this man who seemed so out of place in the world of mops and brooms. But something held her back, perhaps the same thing that made him keep his distance. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her drawing, the encounter lingering in her mind. As the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Gray than met the eye. He was always there, moving silently through the halls, fixing what was broken, cleaning up what was left behind. But there was an air of melancholy about him, as if he was haunted by something no one else could see. She began to watch him more closely, noticing the small things, how he lingered a little too long near the biology lab, or how his hands, though rough and calloused, handled the most delicate of tasks with surprising care. One afternoon, as she sat in the library flipping through an old magazine, Emily came across a photo that made her heart skip a beat. The man in the picture was much younger, clean-shaven, with a confident smile that seemed worlds away from the quiet janitor she had come to know. But the eyes, those unmistakable, sorrowful eyes, were the same. She stared at the image, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. The bell rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. She shoved the magazine into her bag, her heart pounding as she realized she might be onto something bigger than she had imagined. As she hurried out of the library, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Gray in the hallway, quietly mopping the floor. He looked up as she passed, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Who was this man really? And what was he hiding? The questions swirled in her mind as she made her way to class, the mystery of Mr. Gray now firmly lodged in her thoughts. There was something about him, something important, something worth uncovering, and she was determined to find out what it was, no matter where it led her. Emily couldn't shake the image from the magazine out of her mind. The resemblance between Mr. Gray and the man in that photo was too striking to be a mere coincidence. But why would someone who looked like that, a man who seemed important, confident, be working as a janitor in a small-town high school? The question gnawed at her, distracting her during classes and filling her thoughts as she wandered the halls. She returned to the library after school, determined to find that magazine again. As she flipped through the pages, her heart raced, half expecting the image to have vanished, like a figment of her imagination. But there it was, staring back at her. The same face, though younger and without the weariness that now marked Mr. Gray's features. The caption read, "Dr. Jonathan Harper, pioneering surgeon, talks about the future of medicine." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Dr. Jonathan Harper. The name meant nothing to her, but the title, surgeon, echoed in her mind. Could it be? Could Mr. Gray, the quiet man who swept the floors and fixed leaking faucets, once have been a renowned doctor? It seemed impossible, yet the pieces were beginning to fit together. She quickly scanned the article, though the medical jargon was beyond her. It spoke of breakthrough procedures, of a man at the height of his career. There were photos of him in a hospital, surrounded by other doctors, all looking at him with respect and admiration. But there was no mention of what had happened to him, no explanation for why a man with such promise would end up in a place like Glenwood High. Emily closed the magazine, her mind swirling with possibilities. She needed to know more, but how? She couldn't just ask Mr. Gray outright. It would be too forward, too risky. But maybe she didn't have to. Maybe the answer lay in the library, in the forgotten corners of the internet, or perhaps even in the memories of someone who knew him before. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Principal Maggie Lawson entering the library, her usual air of calm authority softened by a warm smile as she spotted Emily. "Burning the midnight oil?" Maggie asked, her voice kind but curious. Emily nodded, trying to hide the magazine she'd been reading. "Just catching up on some research," she replied, her heart racing. She knew Maggie was well respected, someone who had seen a lot in her years at Glenwood High. But had she seen through Mr. Gray's quiet demeanor? Did she suspect there was more to him than met the eye? Maggie approached, her eyes briefly scanning the cover of the magazine before meeting Emily's. "Dr. Harper was quite the figure in his time," she said thoughtfully. "A real pioneer in his field. But that was years ago." Emily felt a jolt of excitement mixed with fear. Did Maggie know? Was she aware of who Mr. Gray really was? The principal's expression was unreadable, giving nothing away. "Do you know what happened to him?" Emily asked, trying to sound casual, though she was anything but. Maggie hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "There were rumors. Tragedies can change a person, sometimes in ways we don't expect. But people move on, or at least they try to. It's not always easy, though." Emily wanted to press for more, but something in Maggie's tone warned her against it. There was a protectiveness there, as if she was guarding a secret, one that Emily wasn't yet ready to uncover. "Is everything all right, Emily?" Maggie asked gently, her gaze softening. Emily forced a smile, nodding. "Yes, just a lot on my mind, I guess. Thanks, Mrs. Lawson." Maggie returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "All right, then. But remember, if you ever need to talk, my door is always open." With that, the principal left the library, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts once more. She knew she was getting closer to the truth, but the more she uncovered, the more complicated things seemed to become. What had happened to Dr. Jonathan Harper? And why was he here, hiding in plain sight as Mr. Gray? As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of something big, something that could change everything she thought she knew about the quiet man who swept the floors of Glenwood High. The questions lingered unanswered as she made her way out of the library and into the gathering dusk, determined to find the truth, no matter where it led her. The days that followed felt like a blur for Emily. Every time she saw Mr. Gray, her mind raced with the questions she was too afraid to ask. She continued her research, spending long hours in the library, but information on Dr. Jonathan Harper after his disappearance was scarce. The mystery only deepened, pulling her further into its web. Meanwhile, Glenwood High buzzed with activity as it prepared for a special event. A visit from Deputy Richard Hayes, a well-known local politician and an alumnus of the school. The entire town was talking about it, and the staff and students were eager to impress. Emily, however, found herself distracted, her thoughts constantly returning to Mr. Gray and the secrets he seemed to be hiding. On the day of the visit, the school was bustling with excitement. Banners were hung, and the auditorium was prepared for Deputy Hayes' speech. Mr. Gray moved through the crowd of students and staff, quietly doing his job, his presence almost unnoticed amid the commotion. Emily sat in the back of the auditorium, her mind drifting as Deputy Hayes began his speech. He spoke of his time at Glenwood High, of the values it had instilled in him, and of the importance of community and service. The audience listened intently, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the man who had become an enigma in her life. After the speech, Deputy Hayes made his way through the school, shaking hands and chatting with students and teachers. He was a tall, charismatic man with a commanding presence, his grey hair slicked back and his suit impeccably tailored. As he moved down the hallway, he noticed Mr. Gray mopping the floor near the science labs. For a moment, their eyes met. Deputy Hayes paused, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He studied Mr. Gray for a second longer, as if trying to place him, but then shook his head and continued on, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. Emily, who had been watching from a distance, felt her heart skip a beat. Had he recognized him? Later that day, as Mr. Gray was cleaning the auditorium, Deputy Hayes returned, this time without the entourage of students and staff. He approached Mr. Gray cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he took in the older man's features. "Have we met before?" Hayes asked, his tone polite but probing. Mr. Gray looked up from his work, his expression carefully neutral. "I don't believe so, sir," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "I'm just the janitor here." Hayes frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You look familiar. What's your name?" "Thomas Gray," the janitor answered, not a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Just Thomas." There was a tense silence as Hayes continued to study him, the gears in his mind turning. But Mr. Gray's demeanor gave nothing away. Finally, Hayes nodded slowly, though his eyes remained suspicious. "Well, Mr. Gray, it's a pleasure to meet you," Hayes said, offering a handshake. Mr. Gray took it, his grip firm but unassuming. As Hayes walked away, Mr. Gray watched him go, his face revealing none of the turmoil that churned inside him. Emily, who had been hiding around the corner, felt a wave of unease wash over her. Something had just happened, something important. The way Mr. Gray had deflected the questions, the look of suspicion on Deputy Hayes' face. It all pointed to a connection, one that Mr. Gray was desperate to keep hidden. That evening, as Emily replayed the events in her mind, she couldn't help but feel that the encounter had set something in motion. Deputy Hayes wouldn't forget the face of the man he had met that day, and neither would Emily. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but what they would reveal was still a mystery. She knew one thing for sure. The past Mr. Gray was trying so hard to hide was beginning to catch up with him, and when it did, the fallout could affect not just him, but everyone at Glenwood High. The tension that had started with Deputy Hayes' visit lingered in the air at Glenwood High. Emily felt it in every hallway she walked through, every classroom she entered. The quiet moments she once shared with Mr. Gray now felt charged with unspoken questions and hidden truths. She could tell that he was more on edge, his eyes darting around more often, as if he were constantly aware of being watched. Emily's curiosity, however, had only grown. She couldn't let go of the mystery, even though she knew it might lead her into uncomfortable territory. She started to spend more time in the library, combing through old records, trying to find any trace of Dr. Jonathan Harper. But it was as if he had vanished into thin air after the incident that had ruined his career. There were no news articles, no interviews, just a few mentions in medical journals, and then nothing. One afternoon, while searching through old school yearbooks in the library's dusty archives, Emily stumbled upon something unexpected. As she flipped through the pages of a yearbook from over 2 decades ago, her breath caught in her throat. There, in a small black and white photo, was a much younger version of Deputy Hayes, standing next to a man in a doctor's coat. The caption underneath read, "Deputy Richard Hayes and Dr. Jonathan Harper after a successful charity fundraiser." Emily's heart raced as she stared at the photo. The connection was undeniable. This was the same man who now swept the floors of her school. But what was the connection between them? And why had Mr. Gray, Dr. Harper, ended up here of all places? She took the yearbook with her, carefully slipping it into her backpack. As she left the library, she caught sight of Mr. Gray in the hallway, his back to her as he replaced a light bulb in one of the ceiling fixtures. She hesitated for a moment, then approached him, the weight of the discovery heavy on her shoulders. "Mr. Gray," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he acknowledged, his voice as calm as ever. "What can I do for you?" For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had so many questions, but no idea where to start. Finally, she decided to take a chance. "I found an old yearbook," she began cautiously, "from when Deputy Hayes was a student here. There was a photo of him with a doctor, Dr. Jonathan Harper." She watched his face closely, but Mr. Gray didn't react. His expression remained calm, though she could see a flicker of something, fear, resignation, in his eyes. "Is that you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence. Mr. Gray looked down at the floor, as if weighing his options, deciding how much to reveal. Finally he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was me once. A long time ago." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had expected him to deny it, to brush her off like he had done before. But here he was, admitting the truth, even if only a small part of it. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Mr. Gray hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "It's a long story, Emily," he said softly. "One I'm not sure you're ready to hear. But I will tell you this. Sometimes, Life takes you places you never expected to go. And sometimes, the only way to keep moving forward is to leave everything behind. Emily could see the pain in his eyes, the burden he had been carrying for so long. She wanted to know more, to understand what had driven him to this point, but she also knew that pushing too hard might cause him to retreat even further. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her voice gentle. "I'm here if you ever want to talk." Mr. Gray gave her a small, sad smile. "You're a good kid, Emily. Don't let this weigh on you too much. Some things are better left in the past." With that, he turned back to his work, leaving Emily standing there, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. She knew now that the man she had come to know as Mr. Gray was hiding from something, someone, far bigger than she had imagined. But what was it? And why was he here, in this small town, of all places? As she walked away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But with every answer she uncovered, more questions seemed to arise. She was getting closer to the truth, but she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous things might become, not just for Mr. Gray, but for everyone involved. The tension between Emily and Mr. Gray grew thicker with each passing day. Every glance, every brief exchange between them carried an unspoken understanding that something big was on the horizon. Emily could sense that Mr. Gray was bracing himself for whatever was coming, but she couldn't quite tell if he was ready to face it, or if she was, for that matter. The situation took an unexpected turn when Principal Maggie Lawson called Mr. Gray into her office one quiet afternoon. Emily, walking past the office, noticed the door slightly ajar and couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. She knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, but something in Maggie's tone, a mixture of concern and urgency, made her pause. "Thomas," Maggie began, her voice low, "I've been meaning to talk to you. Well, let's just say I've come across some information that doesn't quite add up." There was a long silence. Emily could barely make out Mr. Gray's response, but it was clear that he was on edge. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice cautious. Maggie sighed. "Look, I'm not here to judge you, but there are things I've heard, things I've seen that make me believe you're not exactly who you say you are. I've done my best to protect your privacy, but I need to know the truth, if not for my sake, then for the sake of this school." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Would Mr. Gray finally reveal his true identity to someone in authority, or would he continue to hide behind the facade he had so carefully constructed? There was another pause, and then Mr. Gray spoke, his voice tinged with resignation. "You're right, Maggie," he said quietly. "I haven't been completely honest with you. My name isn't really Thomas Gray.
I'm Jonathan Harper."
Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Hearing him say it out loud made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. She held her breath, straining to hear every word. Maggie was silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by the admission. "Dr. Jonathan Harper," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. "The surgeon, Mr. Gray." "No," Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, that was me, once, before everything fell apart." Maggie leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her. "I remember hearing about you," she said softly. "You were a brilliant doctor. What happened?" Dr. Harper took a deep breath, and for the first time, his voice cracked with emotion. "I made a mistake, Maggie. A terrible, irreversible mistake. I lost a patient, a child. It was my fault, and it destroyed everything. I couldn't go on, not like that. So, I left it all behind, changed my name, started over, and here I am." Maggie looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. "All these years. Why didn't you tell anyone?" He shook his head. "I was ashamed. I wanted to disappear, to live a quiet life where no one would know what I'd done. But it seems the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run." Emily's heart ached for him. The pain in his voice was palpable, and she realized that all the rumors, all the questions, had only scratched the surface of the tragedy he had been carrying with him. Maggie sighed deeply, as if the weight of Dr. Harper's confession had transferred to her. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "This is a lot to take in." "I understand," Dr. Harper said softly. "If you want me to leave, I will. I never wanted to cause trouble here. I just wanted to do some good, even if it was in a small way." Maggie was silent for a long time, clearly wrestling with the decision before her. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm but kind. "You've done a lot for this school, for the students. I can't deny that. But you need to understand, this can't stay a secret forever. Sooner or later, someone else will find out, and it might not be as understanding as I am." Dr. Harper nodded, his expression resigned. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm ready to face whatever comes." As the conversation drew to a close, Emily realized she had been holding her breath. She quickly moved away from the door, her mind racing with everything she had just heard. The truth was out now, but what would happen next? Would Maggie keep his secret, or would the rest of the school soon learn that their janitor was once a famous surgeon with a dark past? One thing was certain. The quiet life Dr. Harper had built for himself was about to be shattered, and as much as Emily wanted to help, she knew there was little she could do but wait and see how it all unfolded. The revelation of Mr. Gray's true identity hung over Glenwood High like a dark cloud, casting shadows over the usual routines and rhythms of school life. Principal Lawson, though still grappling with the weight of what she had learned, kept the secret close, choosing to give Dr. Harper the space he needed to decide how to move forward. But the walls of secrecy were thin, and it didn't take long for whispers to start circulating among the staff. It began innocuously enough, a few stray comments here, a curious glance there, but soon the undercurrent of suspicion grew stronger. Emily noticed it immediately. Teachers who once greeted Mr. Gray with warm smiles now regarded him with thinly veiled wariness. Students who had never paid him much attention began to watch him closely, as if trying to puzzle out the man behind the mop and bucket. Emily herself was torn. She had known about Mr. Gray's past before the rest of the school, but hearing it confirmed in Principal Lawson's office had made it all the more real. She wanted to reach out, to offer him some kind of comfort, but she wasn't sure how. Every time she saw him, he seemed more withdrawn, more distant, as if retreating into himself was the only way he could cope with the rising tide of curiosity and judgment. The situation came to a head during a school assembly. Deputy Hayes, having kept quiet about his suspicions since his last visit, had returned to Glenwood High, this time with a clear agenda. He stood at the podium, addressing the students and faculty with his usual charm, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "I've always believed that this school is a pillar of our community," Hayes began, his gaze sweeping across the auditorium. "A place where we can trust those who guide and protect our children. But trust is a fragile thing, isn't it? It can be easily broken when the truth is hidden." The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. Emily, sitting near the back, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew where this was going, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. "There's a man in this school," Hayes continued, his voice growing sharper, who has not been entirely honest about who he is. A man who has a past that, if known, might change how we see him. I'm talking, of course, about your janitor, Mr. Gray. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of confusion and surprise. All eyes turned toward Mr. Gray, who was standing at the side of the auditorium, his face pale and drawn. Emily watched in horror as the carefully constructed world he had built for himself began to crumble. Or should I say, Dr. Jonathan Harper, Hayes said, his tone accusatory. A man who once held the lives of others in his hands, and who now hides behind a broom. What kind of example does this set for our children? What kind of message does it send when a man who failed so spectacularly can just run away from his mistakes? The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to speak up. Emily felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. This wasn't right. Whatever mistakes Dr. Harper had made, he didn't deserve to be publicly shamed like this. But what could she do? She was just one student, one voice in a sea of many. As the assembly descended into a buzz of whispered conversations and shocked stares, Principal Lawson stepped forward, her expression stern. "That's enough, Richard," she said firmly, cutting through the noise. "This is not the place for this discussion." Hayes turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "And where is the place, Maggie? When the safety and integrity of our school are at stake, don't the people deserve to know the truth?" "The truth," Lawson replied, her voice steady, "is that Dr. Harper has been a dedicated member of our school community. Whatever his past may be, it's not for us to judge. He has the right to live his life without fear of being hunted down for mistakes he has already paid dearly for." The auditorium fell silent, the tension palpable. Emily held her breath, hoping against hope that the principal's words would be enough to quell the rising storm. But Hayes wasn't finished. "I understand your loyalty, Maggie," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But you have to ask yourself, is this really the kind of man we want around our children? Someone who couldn't handle the pressure of his profession, who let a child die under his care." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and Emily saw Mr. Gray, Dr. Harper, flinch as if physically struck. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Standing up, she called out, her voice trembling but clear. "That's not fair. You don't know what he's been through, what he's done to make up for it. He's a good person, and he doesn't deserve this." All eyes turned to her, the shock of hearing a student speak out against a powerful figure like Hayes rippling through the crowd. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground, determined to defend the man who had done nothing but good since arriving at Glenwood High. Hayes stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to the crowd. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but that's not for us to decide. The truth is out now, and it's up to the community to make their judgment." With that, the assembly was abruptly dismissed, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Mr. Gray, no, Dr. Harper, stood motionless as the students filed out, whispers and glances following him like a shadow. Emily lingered, her eyes locked on him, willing him to look up, to acknowledge that she was on his side. But he remained still, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The consequences of that revelation were just beginning to unfold, and Emily feared what might come next. The days following the assembly were a blur of uncertainty and tension. The revelation of Dr. Harper's past had spread like wildfire through Glenwood High, and the once quiet janitor found himself at the center of a storm he couldn't control. Students whispered in the hallways, teachers exchanged uneasy glances, and everywhere Dr. Harper went, he felt the weight of their judgment. Emily watched helplessly as the man she had come to respect retreated further into himself. He moved through the school like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The friendly nods and polite greetings he used to offer had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Principal Lawson did her best to manage the situation, urging the staff to remain professional and reminding the students to focus on their studies. But even she couldn't quell the growing unease that had settled over the school. The once tight-knit community was fraying at the edges, and it seemed only a matter of time before something snapped. The breaking point came during a routine staff meeting. Tensions had been building for days, and it all came to a head when Mr. Thompson, one of the senior teachers, voiced what everyone else had been too afraid to say. "I don't see how we can continue to have someone like that working here," he said, his voice firm but laced with unease. "It's not just about his past. It's about the message it sends to the students. How can we expect them to trust us if we're not honest with them about who we have in this school?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Maggie Lawson, sitting at the head of the table, looked tired, her eyes shadowed with worry. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable, yet hoping against hope that it wouldn't come to this. "Mr. Thompson," she began, choosing her words carefully, "Dr. Harper has served this school with dedication and integrity since the day he arrived. Whatever happened in his past is not for us to judge. It's something he has already paid a heavy price for." "But what if it happens again?" another teacher interjected, her voice tinged with fear. "What if he can't handle the pressure? We have to think about the safety of our students." Maggie sighed, feeling the weight of their concerns pressing down on her. "I understand your fears," she said softly, "but I also believe in redemption. Dr. Harper has shown nothing but kindness and professionalism in his time here. We need to give him a chance to prove that he's more than his past mistakes." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. No one spoke, but the unease was palpable, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Just then, the door to the staff room creaked open, and all heads turned to see Dr. Harper standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed with the strain of the last few days. He had clearly overheard the conversation, and the pain in his expression was impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I never meant to cause any harm. If my presence here is too much, I'll leave. I don't want to be a burden." Maggie stood up, her heart aching at the sight of him. "You're not a burden, Jonathan," she said gently, "but we need to address this openly, for everyone's sake." Dr. Harper nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I understand," he murmured. "Whatever you decide, I'll accept it." As he turned to leave, Emily, who had been listening from just outside the door, felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let him go like this, not without a fight. Steeling herself, she stepped into the room, all eyes suddenly on her. "This isn't fair," she blurted out, her voice shaky but resolute. "Dr. Harper has been nothing but good to us. He made a mistake, but haven't we all? Shouldn't we be helping him, not pushing him away?" The room fell into a stunned silence. Emily's words hung in the air, echoing the thoughts that some had been too afraid to voice. Dr. Harper turned to look at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. But there was something else there too, something like hope, flickering faintly behind the exhaustion. Maggie finally broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "Emily's right. We need to remember that everyone deserves a second chance. Dr. Harper has made mistakes, but he's here now, trying to do better. We owe it to him, and to ourselves, to support him in that." The staff exchanged glances, some nodding, others still hesitant. But the mood in the room had shifted. The seeds of understanding had been planted, and while it would take time for them to grow, the first steps had been taken. As the meeting ended, Dr. Harper gave Emily a small, grateful smile. She returned it, knowing that this was far from over, but at least they had a fighting chance. The atmosphere at Glenwood High began to change, albeit slowly. The tension from Dr. Harper's revelations still lingered, but there was a growing sense of resolve among those who had chosen to stand by him. Emily's words during the staff meeting had sparked something, a reminder that everyone carried burdens and that compassion was needed now more than ever. Dr. Harper, though still cautious, began to open up a little more. He continued his work quietly, but now there were small signs of life returning to his once reserved demeanor. He exchanged brief but genuine smiles with students in the hallways, and his conversations with Principal Lawson became less about his departure and more about how he could still contribute meaningfully to the school. Emily noticed the shift and felt a swell of pride. Her small act of courage had made a difference, but she knew there was still work to be done, bridges to rebuild and trust to earn back. She decided to take the first step, approaching Dr. Harper one afternoon as he was tidying up the art room. "Mr. Gray, Dr. Harper," she began, stumbling over his name. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" He looked up from his work, a hint of a smile on his lips. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, and I'm sorry you've had to go through all this. It's not fair." Dr. Harper set down the mop and gave her his full attention. "You don't have to apologize, Emily. I appreciate what you said in that meeting. It took a lot of courage." Emily blushed slightly but pressed on. "I just wanted people to see what I see, a good person who's trying to make up for his mistakes. And I was wondering if there's anything I can do to help. I know it's not much, but I want to support you however I can." Dr. Harper's expression softened. "Your support means more than you know," he said sincerely. "I'm just trying to find my way, like everyone else. But if you want to help, well, maybe you can keep doing what you're doing. Remind people that we all deserve a second chance." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of purpose. "I can do that," she promised. As she left the art room, Emily felt a renewed determination. She couldn't change the past, but she could help shape what came next. And as for Dr. Harper, she believed he could find redemption, not just in the eyes of the community, but within himself. The days that followed saw small but significant changes. Some students, inspired by Emily's bravery, began to reach out to Dr. Harper, asking for advice or simply chatting with him as he worked. Teachers who had been hesitant started to warm up to him again, remembering the respect they once held for him before his secret was revealed. It was a slow process, but Glenwood High was beginning to heal. And in that healing, there was hope, not just for Dr. Harper, but for everyone who had been touched by his story. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere at Glenwood High continued to shift. The initial shock of Dr. Harper's past had faded, replaced by a cautious acceptance. The students and staff had come to see him not as a man defined by his mistakes, but as someone who had chosen to face them and start anew. Dr. Harper found himself increasingly involved in the life of the school. It started small, helping a few students with their science projects, offering advice on difficult problems, and lending an ear to those who needed someone to talk to. His experience and wisdom, once hidden behind the humble role of a janitor, were now becoming a valuable resource for the students and staff alike. Emily noticed how Dr. Harper's demeanor changed as he began to engage more with the school community. There was a lightness to his steps, a warmth in his interactions that hadn't been there before. The students, too, responded to him differently, no longer seeing him as just the janitor, but as someone they could trust and look up to. One afternoon, as the school was preparing for a small community event, Emily found herself working alongside Dr. Harper in the gymnasium. They were setting up chairs and decorations, chatting easily about the upcoming event. "You know," Dr. Harper said, pausing to adjust a banner, "I never imagined I'd find a place like this again. After everything that happened, I thought my life would be nothing but regret. But this school, it's given me a second chance. And I have you to thank for that." Emily looked up at him, surprised. "Me? I didn't do anything special." Dr. Harper smiled gently. "You stood up for me when no one else would. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. That's something special, Emily. You've reminded me that it's never too late to start over." Emily felt a swell of emotion at his words. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly. "This place wouldn't be the same without you." The event that evening was a success, bringing together students, parents, and teachers in a celebration of community. Dr. Harper watched from the sidelines, a contented smile on his face as he saw the school thriving. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with where he was and who he had become. As the night drew to a close, Principal Lawson approached him, her expression warm. "I'm glad you're here, Jonathan," she said, using his real name for the first time in a long while. "You've made a real difference." Dr. Harper nodded, gratitude welling up inside him. "Thank you, Maggie. I finally feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." The school's journey with Dr. Harper had been a tumultuous one, filled with challenges and hard truths. But in the end, it was a story of redemption, of a man who, despite his past, had found a new purpose in life, and of a community that had learned to look beyond the surface and see the value of second chances. Glenwood High would never be the same, but in many ways, it was better for having him there. And as Dr. Harper looked out at the smiling faces around him, he knew that he had finally found his place. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.